African American Legends highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, and African American history. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I am your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is Joan Maynard, who's Executive Director of the Weeksville Society, an organization that is preserving the history of African Americans in Brooklyn. Joan, glad to have you with us today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here, Dr. Brown.
I know you've been working on this for many, many years. I know your family's been involved in it. But I'd like you to tell our audience about the origin of what was called the Weeksville Project and is now the Weeksville Society.
Oh, that's a really good question, because actually we're one of the many organizations that grew out, I think, all around the country following the civil rights movement in this country, because we actually were founded in 1968. And we were very fortunate to find the first place for somebody to give us a little room and a telephone was in a unit of the City University.
And you, of course, have been a trustee of the City University some years ago.
Yes, that was a great experience.
And certainly contributed to the development of some of the things we're doing now. Now, Weeksville itself is physically located in what is now called the Bedford-Stuyvesant area.
Yes, it's in southern Bed-Stuy or northern Crown Heights. It's actually at the cusp where the two areas meet, because there's been many map and how can I say community changes over the years. But if you would you like to hear where the site is right now?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, the site, which is now a New York City landmark and also on the National Register of Historic Places in the United States, is located on Bergen Street between Buffalo and Rochester Avenue. And we're directly across the street from an 1,100-unit low-income housing project of the City of New York called the Kingsborough Houses.
And of course, for those who don't know Brooklyn, large place, the main drag it goes through it along the railroad, runs along there, is Atlantic Avenue.
Yes.
And you are north of Atlantic Avenue, but you're also south.
We're south of Atlantic Avenue.
South of Atlantic Avenue.
Well, we're north of Eastern Parkway.
Okay. And
yes.
Eastern Parkway, of course, is a street that runs right into the Brooklyn Museum.
Yes.
And eventually into the Brooklyn Bridge.
A marvelous avenue. There's great things in Brooklyn.
I know. You know, the world begins and ends in Brooklyn, according to Brooklyn.
For sure, sure. I was born in Brooklyn, so I have a slight bias, you understand.
And those of us who are Dodger fans still lament the loss of the Brooklyn Dodgers and our good friend Jackie Robinson.
Yes.
Now, Weeksville, at the time that this community existed, this was the 1840s and 1850s, all the way to the 1880s,
yes,
was really farmland. And the name stems from the person who bought the land that started this community.
Yes. His name was James Weeks. He was not the first landowner in the area, but he was a person who actually lived there, because there were a few other people, African-American people, who had bought land but didn't stay there. These people were smart. They were speculating. But James Weeks actually bought a piece of land, and he became so respected in his community that it evolved so that here we had a place called Weeksville that actually appeared on city maps by 1849.
In other words, he bought the property in 1838 or 1840?
Yeah, 1838. He actually bought it from a portion of a property that belonged to the Lefferts family, a very large landowning family with a lot of history in Brooklyn.
Yeah, they have a street named after, like Lefferts Avenue.
Yes, like boulevards, all sorts of things.
Now, to put this in context for the audience, this was before slavery ended.
Oh, yes.
Slavery didn't end until 1865. Mm-hmm. This was a time when African Americans could not own property in most parts of the country, but in New York they could.
Yes.
And they could also vote, I understand.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting thing. Slavery actually ended physically in New York State, 1827, although there were certain little things that you had to stay in some sort of form of servitude. So there actually were people held in some form of slavery in New York State up until about 1850. James Weeks came from Virginia, and when he left Virginia, that was definitely a very, very slave state. And here he couldn't read or write, but he managed to get himself a job. He worked down at what is now the South Street Seaport, and that was not a place of entertainment or good food or drinks at the time. It was serious hard work, and he was a stevedore, and he managed to he did heavy hard work because that's what he could do, and he managed to buy a piece of land, the same piece of land from the Lefferts family. And by 1846, we have an account from a Brooklyn paper. He was called to chair a meeting, and one of the things that they were talking about, they could vote for a representative that would go up to the state legislature. I don't think they were in Albany yet. I think they were in Poughkeepsie, and he was urging his fellow citizens to vote for somebody who would represent them. This is a powerful man. I consider him a great Brooklyn pioneer.
And the language he used, to be elected without property qualifications or coloration of...
Or complexional qualifications. That's fabulous.
That's really a nuance. We could probably use that in 1996.
Yeah, a great man with great vision, you know.
And now, how many houses were constituted? How many families lived in Weeksville?
I know we do have a New York Age paper, I think it was about 1911, that spoke, that gave the names of about 40 families and said that they lived in Weeksville.
The New York Age, of course, was a black newspaper.
Oh, a major paper. And in fact, the scholars who want to do research about African Americans in New York City, they all know where this collection is at Schomburg Library, and they go over those because you realize that newspapers were the only form of records that we actually had, so that newspapers were not the casual thing that we have today. They became really, they became the savers of our history in many ways.
The black press in particular, as I've talked with many of the guests on African American Legend, almost always comes back to the black press.
Yes.
To develop an understanding of what we were doing in the 18th century and the 19th century, and the 20th century, really through the age of television.
That's right.
And television and integration more or less has changed the nature of the black press, and that the white press, the larger press, reports on considerations of African Americans, and many of the dialogues exist in the white press. But the black press has really been the savior of African American history.
Absolutely. I remember a few years ago at Schomburg, there was a exhibition on the black press, and the young woman who was the curator, Gretchen Sorin, her father was a reporter for the old Baltimore Afro-American. So you see that this thread just keeps going through.
But the Baltimore Afro-American, Washington Afro-American still exist.
Oh, yes.
As does the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the New York Amsterdam News. Now, as Weeksville developed, it developed, I guess, through 1880, 1883, and then began to be absorbed in the larger community?
Yeah, I think that you give a good date there, because in 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was completed. And this allowed people to travel more easily from Brooklyn to Manhattan. Prior to that, if you expected to get to Manhattan, there's no subways, you know, and so you took little ferries. So that the minute that the Brooklyn Bridge was completed, Brooklyn became more of like a kind of a bedroom community, and it was really open farmland until very recently. And you found a lot. Then you also realized that we were coming into the period of Reconstruction. Brooklyn, New York was not immune from all of the political forces that were happening, the social forces. Then you also had a series of terrible things happening in Europe, like the Irish potato famine and other things happening in Central Europe, so that you had waves of immigrants coming, so that you can see that the whatever personality or outstanding culture that Weeksville had, it was absorbed in this larger wave of humanity.
The other thing that many people don't realize is Brooklyn was an independent city until 1899.
It's 1898, and I tell you, it's one of the things that I rue, because it's one of the things, because Brooklyn was a separate city. I think of it as a separate city. But in 1998, when New York City celebrates its 100th birthday, Brooklyn's going to be really out there. Weeksville's going to be really out there.
Okay, all right. Well, I can see you're a Brooklynite. You're born, bred, and living in Brooklyn. Now, how did you find the Weeksville community? Because these old houses were in this area right off of Bergen Street. Did it have something to do with an airplane flight? Oh,
yes, yeah, because I didn't find them. I certainly have to talk about a fellow named James Hurley, who was an Irish guy from Boston, who was a historian, also a naval photographer in the war. and Joseph Haynes, an African American living in Weeksville, but hadn't known about this history. He was a airplane pilot. He not only had a license to fly a plane, he had a license to teach people how to fly. He was a professional engineer, still is a professional engineer, being a troubleshooter from the Transit Authority for many years. And after he retired from that, he went to work for the federal government as a member of the Federal Transportation Safety Board, and he flew around the country examining plane and train accidents. Yeah, and he's still the treasurer of our board, and we love him to death. He's been like a person that any horrible stuff that happens, let's call it a joke, because he's going to do something magnificent person.
Now, what motivated them to take this flight to find this community?
Well, Jim Hurley had been doing walking tours for the Museum of the City of New York. Then he got invited to do a course, not for credit course, at something called the Pratt Neighborhood College. And then his job was to inform the students about Brooklyn neighborhoods, because Brooklyn is a city of neighborhoods, really. And the plan was to talk about Bensonhurst and Bay Ridge and Ridgewood and Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights and whatever. When the course opened at Pratt, a couple of people came, but only two stayed, two black women, Dolores McCullough and Pat Johnson. And here was this little bit of information, just a teeny bit of information about Weeksville. And they said, we want to know about Weeksville. That was the beginning. They were the people who started it all off.
And so then you took the flight to identify these old houses. How many old houses
using
were
old maps, because they had seen the Hunterfly Road. There are 4 houses that are identified and miraculously still standing, which we now own, thank God.
And you have contributed in the society to getting the funds to renovate those houses.
Yeah, it's a continuing process, shall we say. I think all things being equal, if the political scene had not changed so radically, they would have been completed. They would really be serving the city of New York as they should, because we could have full visitation. These are very unique houses.
But the houses are in good shape now because of your efforts.
Yes, they're in pretty good shape. They could be in better shape. They're not completely restored. Each house has its own little story. They're in various stages of restoration, but they're all being used.
And of course, you're the consummate teacher. You're an artist as well as a teacher. And you have reached out to the schools, beginning with the schools that are close by,
yes,
to many, many schools in Brooklyn to both assist in the dig to identify the artifacts and also to assist in developing the story.
Yeah. Well, the person that I would like to mention here is Dr. Margaret C. Thompson, who, in fact, it was the Weeksville school children who first had the idea about saving these houses when the houses were identified. And it couldn't have happened without terrific teachers. I have such regard for good teachers. A good teacher is worth more than anything else in the city of New York or any place else. But through Dr. Margaret Thompson, who was a staff facilitator at the school and also affiliated with the Bank Street College of Education, and they had a great program called Community as Classroom, and which allowed us as a not-for-profit community organization to come in and work with the school system. This doesn't normally happen. People don't want strange people coming into school and reacting to people. But because of Dr. Thompson's vision and wisdom, we were allowed to do that. And because we had that experience, it made it easier for us to work with other schools and other children.
And over the years, I guess tens of thousands of
yeah, right
children
now,
and adults have visited the Weeksville
about
site.
3,000 a year. Even in this incompleted state. That is why I know that the completed state, which would allow us to fully use it, will be absolutely fantastic. We have people coming from all over the world. We don't put ads in the papers to say come. They come.
But you are designated as a New York City landmark and in the National Registry of Historic Places by
Yes.
the United States Park Service.
That's right.
And they have actually published a book
Yes.
which shows Weeksville, gives some of the history, talks about you and your family. Because the next thing I want to ask is, how did you get interested in Weeksville?
Well, I've always been interested in who I was as a person. I had 2 great parents. My father.
Everybody does.
Yes, oh, of course, too. But you have to acknowledge them. And I tell you, as the older I get, I see how they're more precious to me.
And
each
how far-sighted they were.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And they inculcated in you the need, the desire to preserve and understand African American history.
Yes, and beyond that, African history. You know, that so I always understood our history didn't start with slavery in 1619.
Well, that's true with most African Americans who experienced cultural development either through their church, through their family, or through segregated schools. One of the sad things that has come out of integration is that African American history, or black history, that people like myself who went to a segregated school system in Washington, D.C., and went to Dunbar High School,
yeah.
and we learned all kinds of African American history.
But Dunbar High School, I would say, was the equivalent of any college or university, really, because I've met many people like yourself from there who are outstanding.
But Washington, D.C. was very unique in that it had a substantial middle class, largely because of a steady income due to the civil service. And that helps a lot, a steady income. But
Absolutely.
in the meantime, through the efforts of Malcolm and Martin and the Civil Rights Movement, more and more young people, not so young anymore, became interested in African American history. We made it possible to get the funding and to do the cultural consciousness raising regarding places like Weeksville. So now Weeksville is established. You're on the registry. All you
we need money.
need is money, like every cultural institution.
Yeah, all of the not-for-profits and all of the art and culture, I want to say institutions in this country need help because really it's these institutions, our artists, our musicians, our writers, our actors, actresses. This is the way, really, the way the culture is passed on, and they really shouldn't be seen as little frilly things. It's really
certainly
central to education and to history and culture.
Central development.
Yeah.
And on African American Legends, we deal with photography, we deal with dance and sport and all of the various aspects of African American politics, because that's really the way people understand the past in order to project the future. I think you have a little statement in one of your publications, something on the order, it's a sin not to know your history, but it's an even greater sin not to wish to know your history.
Yeah, it's an African proverb. Not to know is bad, not to wish to know is worse. And it's so true.
Now, you in your work as an artist have created a little booklet which children can cut out and actually make an example of a Weeksville house, plus an outstanding vocabulary, so that they would begin to understand some of the words that are used.
Yes, because we speak about architects and we speak about archaeology, which has been part of the history. When people, and we are very consciously honing ourselves to be a resource for the fourth grade school teacher.
Why did you pick the fourth grade?
Well, I didn't pick it so much. It's a requirement of New York State Education Department.
Why did they pick it?
Well, they somehow or other think that people, when they're in the fourth grade, should learn local history. Then when you get a little older, you learn about American history. Then a little bit later on, you learn about world history. It's a kind of a good age because you're like 9 or 10. You're not a baby, but you're not a little snotty kid yet. You know, and you realize that
and
there
you're
might
curious.
be still, you're curious. And you're not, and you don't look at somebody who's a little older than you and say, I don't want it. You have nothing to tell me, I know everything. So it's a marvelous age, it's a magic age.
But let me suggest this. I have grandchildren, you know people have grandchildren. I find that the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds are very anxious to absorb this information.
Oh yes, it's a magic age.
And so we ought to do Weeksville in kindergarten and first grade.
We do kindergarten and we do first grade, because those are the magic ages. But since the body politic has says you got to do this thing in the fourth grade, we want to at least capitalize on that, because usually if somebody writes a law, there's usually some money attached to this law. I know we are now developing a fourth grade curriculum with Weeksville as the base, and with some monies that we receive from the New York State Education Department.
So you can deal with things like transportation, you can deal with things like politics, voting, development of a community.
Yeah, and I'm very anxious and I feel very passionately about voting. My father, who was born in Brooklyn in 1873, he was born in Brooklyn. His parents came from Georgia and South Carolina. My mother came to this country from Grenada in 1921. And they were older people. But what I did learn about was the value of voting. When my father was about 75, he lived to be 92. But when he was about 75, he had a terrible stroke, and he was in the hospital, and it was a day for voting. And he signed himself out of the hospital, and he got to vote. And when I think about that, because he remembered a time when people were being lynched and other sort of horrible things were happening, and he knew there wasn't any point in sitting and complaining in your house about what was happening if you didn't vote.
Well, particularly in this country where African Americans constitute 12% of the population, Latino Americans probably another 10 or 12%, people of color can do a lot in
Absolutely.
terms of responding to some of the concerns, because my basic view, and I think most African Americans feel this, is what is good for people of color is good for the entire nation, because they're concerned with things like health and education and fairness and justice and housing, so that
which makes a successful society.
And I notice you use the term Weeksville Society, which means it is a community.
Yes. Can I give the long name here?
Give me the long name.
Okay. The full name, both names are legal, the Weeksville Society, or the Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant History. Because most people never heard of Weeksville, but they usually think of Bedford, they know Bed-Stuy, usually with a bit of a negative connotation. I am here to tell you that Bed-Stuy consists of fantastic people who you can see getting up and going to work every morning, seeing the kids do homework, giving kids food, bathing them, doing a lot of things, and then getting up and going to usually a pretty miserable job, doing this year after year. You know, they don't make the 6 o'clock news, so you don't hear about them.
The overwhelming majority of people, practically all of the African American communities work. The fact that we have a 12% unemployment rate means that 88% of people are working. So that the stereotypes that are projected are unfortunate.
And they're very unreal, too.
Are unreal and based on a negative mindset. And one thing about Weeksville gives a positive mindset.
And we want our kids to know this early on.
But see, it's very interesting, the passion that you reflect. The passion is reflected in wanting the children to know.
That's the whole ballgame.
But then the children become adults.
Yeah.
And the idea of the pride of adults, because one of the things that now occurs, particularly in Brooklyn, we have a number of people of African descent who have recently immigrated to the United States from the Caribbean and South America and from Africa.
Yes, yes.
And unfortunately, many of them have internalized, I shouldn't say many, some have internalized the negative views of people of color projected by others.
Yes.
And what Weeksville helps us to do is to recognize that African Americans have always had a culture, that Africans have always had a culture, a structure, a society with pride and the like.
I'm glad you said that, because that is very near and dear to me, because I grew up in, as I say, in the household, two separate streams of the African diaspora. And as time goes on, the populations that you describe are very real, and because the projection of history, just across the board, no matter where you are, is rather limited, the stereotypes that are seen serve to just make these things happen. And now that you have communication going around the world, you can sit in the Caribbean and see some of these stereotypes on your television in the Caribbean.
I hope that some people in the Caribbean see this show, because we are on the PBS satellite network.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why we talk about the legends of African America. And it's as important for white Americans and white from Europe to understand this as it is people of African and Caribbean and Hispanic and Asian descent. And the demographics are such that 50 years from now or thereabouts, half of this country will be people of color.
Absolutely.
They would be from Asia, they'll be from Africa, they'll be indigenous African Americans. But the importance of this is that our society, if it's going to develop, must learn to both appreciate and utilize the diversity that exists in the society. Because
it's already here in many ways. And New York being a port city, right here in New York, sometimes I travel around the country, and even though right now travel makes it easy for people to get from place to place, but for many, many years, at least 50 years that I know about, because I'm older than 50, you could find people from all over the African diaspora living in Brooklyn, speaking English and French and Spanish and Ga and Twi and Papiamento. And again, many people from the continent, African continent, who didn't have the experience of enslavement. So but also who really don't know their history either. So there's a whole lot of folks need history.
Yeah, and of course, history is his story.
Yes.
In many ways.
Or her story.
Exactly. Very briefly, as we come to the close of the program, could you
Yes.
tell us about some of the people on the board, people who are supporting you?
Yes. Our board president now is Mrs. Joanne Williams Carter. Again, a wonderful person. We have a number. Joe Haynes, who I mentioned to you before, is still on our board. Chris Owens, who is Major Owens'
son
son.
of the congressman
Yes,
from that
and
area.
if I leave out anybody, because we do have about 13 functioning members right now. But I would like to mention another name, a person who is not on our board, but who has been very important for us, and I expect will be more important, and that's Dr. Craig Wilder. Craig Wilder graduated from the Department of History at Columbia University and is now teaching at Williams College in Massachusetts. But he is acting as a consultant for us. Another gentleman, Dr. Robert Swan, lives in Brooklyn, probably knows more about African Americans in Brooklyn than anybody living. And we have the benefit of these scholars to help us, because we're not scholars. I'm not a scholar. I'm just an interested person, like to do stuff, you know.
I must say, as we come to close the program, that you definitely are a scholar, you're a believer, you're a motivator, and you have done a magnificent job with the various folks that you've mentioned
Wonderful
in
people.
developing this society, keeping this project alive, and most of all, developing the many educational materials that can be used not only by fourth graders, but by
everybody.
people who have long since graduated from college or become adults.
And this doesn't happen with just me and you. I have two great people, Anna French and Clement Scantlebury. Without them, I don't exist either.
Okay,
My
thank you so
staff.
much, Joan Maynard,
Okay,
for talking
thank you,
with us
Dr. Brown.
about Weeksville and the Weeksville Society.